You wake up to the sound of a bell. Not a cute little hotel concierge ding, not a sleigh bell, not even a distant church chime on a snowy morning. No. This one is closer to a cow having an existential crisis while being repeatedly struck with a frying pan made of sadness. It's loud. It's obnoxious. It's medieval. And it's 4 o'clock in the morning. You're lying on a sack of straw that smells like it lost a fight with a goat. Your pillow is technically your elbow. Congratulations, you live in a medieval village. Welcome to the 13th century, also known as the golden age of having zero privacy and less dental care than a pharaoh badger. Now, before you get too cozy, maybe you're already thinking about drifting off to sleep while I talk about how people used metal objects to scream at each other from towers. Take a second to like this video and subscribe. But only if you actually like what I'm doing here. No pressure. I mean, I'm already up at 3 a.m. writing about livestock and bell towers for strangers on the internet. So go ahead and toss a pity like my way if you're feeling generous. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always weirdly fun to see who's drifting off to sleep in Toronto while someone else is commuting in New Delhi. Okay, back to your horrible peasant life. You don't have a clock. You don't even know what a clock is. The concept of precise timekeeping hasn't exactly reached your village yet, unless you count when the sun is kinda sideways as precision. What you do have, however, is a bell. And that bell is everything. It tells you when to wake up, when to work, when to panic, and when to pretend you're praying while actually just hiding from your obligations behind a pig shed. Bells, you see, were the group chat of the Middle Ages. But louder. And with less of a mute button. Now, in this charming little nowhere village, we'll call it Mudford, because everything is made of mud and it's never not raining. The bell hangs in a squat little wooden tower. It's not the grand Gothic cathedral tower you might be imagining. There's no Notre Dame here. There's no stained glass. The only stained thing is your shirt, and that's mostly from something the chicken did last week. The bell is made of bronze. If you're fancy. If you're not, and let's face it, you're not, it might be made of a cheaper alloy that smells faintly of regret and leftover weapons. It was probably cast by a traveling bell founder who arrived in the village with soot in his beard and a mule that has seen things. He made the bell by pouring molten metal into a mold buried in the ground, probably while muttering in Latin and casually ignoring several safety violations. It's about the size of a small barrel, hangs from a crude wooden yoke, and is operated by a rope that is frayed enough to give you tetanus just by looking at it. The sound? A sort of metallic bellow that tells everyone within earshot, something is happening. Probably bad. Stop milking the goat and come gather awkwardly. Because in a medieval village, bells don't just tell time. They are time. They mark the rhythm of your day, your year, your life, and your eventual depressing funeral. Let's talk about that daily rhythm for a second. You wake up, again, thanks to the bell, not your own will, somewhere between 3:45 and 4:30 a.m. Why so early? Because someone, somewhere, decided the best time to start praying was when your soul still hadn't fully re-entered your body. It's called Matins, the first of 7 daily church services. It's basically a spiritual check-in with God to say, "Hi, yes, I'm still miserable and still here." The bell rings for it, loudly, echoing off the moss-covered walls of your hovel while your neighbor's goat judges your life choices through the window. Then there's lauds around sunrise, prime mid-morning, terce before lunch, sext at noon, no, not that kind of sext, none mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. Every single one punctuated by that same bell, over and over again. It's like living inside a really religious, really persistent microwave. But it wasn't all prayers and boredom. The bell also told you when to work, which, by the way, is always. Fields don't plow themselves, and your Lord isn't going to harvest his own wheat. You head out after the first bell for labor, dragging your aching limbs and possibly a rusty scythe, depending on how generous the last harvest was. If it's Sunday or a feast day, there's a longer bell to mark Mass. You trudge to the little church in the center of Mudford, smelling faintly of damp wool and despair, and try not to fall asleep during a sermon in Latin, a language you don't speak, while a pigeon in the rafters poops judgmentally onto the pews below. You might think bells were boring, but in the medieval village, they were basically the medieval version of the all-in-one app. Notifications? Check. Alarms? Check. Emergency alerts? Absolutely. all delivered via concussive sound waves straight to your skull. Let's not forget the drama bells could cause. Imagine this, you're out back, trying to shovel something out of something else. Suddenly, the bell rings in a panicked, erratic way. This is not the come to mass bell. This is the grab a stick and prepare to die bell. It means either raiders, fire, or someone's ox has gone berserk again. All are possible. All are bad. And the bell is your only warning. Or maybe someone's died. That bell rings in long, solemn tones. You all pause, take off your hats, assuming you even own a hat and it hasn't been eaten by moths, and mutter something vaguely respectful. But no one asks who died. You'll find out eventually. The village only has 80 people, and half of them owe you butter. And now, just to lighten the mood, let's talk about how bells were also believed to scare off demons. That's right. In case you thought the bell's resume wasn't long enough, it also served as medieval ghostbuster. You see, loud noise was thought to banish evil spirits. So if you heard a bell ring during a thunderstorm, it wasn't just announcing bad weather, it was trying to shout the devil out of the sky. Good luck with that. And speaking of shouting, some bells were named. As in, they had names. Not like Steve or Jennifer, but more like Maria Gloriosa or John the Great. People gave them personalities, blessed them in ceremonies, and basically treated them like very loud pets. Some even believed bells could pray on behalf of the community. Imagine thinking your toaster could do your taxes, and you'll get the idea. Bell founders were borderline mystical figures. They had to get the alloy exactly right, because if the bell cracked, it was considered a sign of divine disapproval. God wasn't mad because you forgot to pray. He was mad because your metallurgy was subpar. The casting was often accompanied by prayers, incense, and sometimes even tossing in relics or coins to bless the bell. This may sound weird until you remember modern billionaires do pretty much the same thing, but with Teslas and incense made of sandalwood and ego. Let's pause here and imagine the soundscape of your daily medieval life. Birds. Maybe a river. Occasional screaming. But mostly, that bell. It rings in the morning. It rings for mass. It rings for meals. It rings for danger. It rings because the guy in charge of ringing it is bored and has impulse control issues. It is, in short, the medieval soundtrack of human existence. A single, swinging piece of cast metal that can signal prayer, war, fire, death, weddings, rain, and whether or not it's socially acceptable to eat meat today. And no matter how used to it you are, it's never quiet. There is no do not disturb setting on the Mudford bell. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, why didn't anyone complain? Why didn't anyone just move further from the bell? Excellent question. And here's your answer, you can't. Because the bell is central. Not just physically, but psychologically. It's the loud, swinging heart of the community. It's what makes your village feel like a village, rather than just a bunch of damp peasants pretending they're not slowly dissolving into the mud. The bell is how you know what kind of day it's going to be. A long ring? Sunday. Short rings? Feast day. Erratic, chaotic clanging that sounds like someone is being attacked by bees in a metal closet? Probably bandits. So you live your life in the symphony of strikes. You sleep when it tells you to sleep. You eat when it rings. You marry when it tolls. And eventually, someday, you die, and your final journey will also be marked by that same, slow, mournful bell. And no, there is no snooze button. Now rest your eyes, peasant. The bell won't ring again until dawn. Maybe. You're asleep. Or trying to be. It's the dead of night, not metaphorically, but very literally. Because the moon is out, wolves are howling somewhere disturbingly close, and the only other sound you hear is a suspicious squelching that might be mud or might be something with teeth. But just as you start to slip into your medieval nightmare of running out of leeks before Lent, you hear it. The bell. It rings once. Then again. Then nothing. You sit up in your straw pile, blinking like a confused rat. That's not the usual rhythm. That's not mass. That's not danger. That's, what is that? And then you remember, oh right, the bell ringer's drunk again. See, while everyone talks about lords and priests and knights, the person who arguably controls more of your life than anyone else, aside from, say, God and possibly your landlord goat, is the bell ringer, the sexton. Or if you're feeling fancy, the campanarius. He lives in a little wooden shed next to the church or, in some places, right inside the church tower itself. A man of mystery. A man of smell. A man who sleeps next to the thing he controls. His entire job? To yank that rope at the right time, in the right way, while hopefully not falling out of the tower in the process. Think of him as the human version of a smartphone alarm. If the smartphone was powered by beer, poorly mended socks, and a sense of unearned authority. Before we go further, you might assume this man is deeply respected. After all, he gets to announce the arrival of God's word, the time to work, the hour of rest. He literally sets the tone of the village. You'd be wrong. He's mostly feared. Or mocked. Sometimes both. He knows things. He sees things. He's in the church tower when nobody else is. He knows who sneaks out for midnight meetings and who's been napping through Compline. But more importantly, he's unpredictable. Because ringing the bell properly? Not as easy as it sounds. There's technique involved. The rhythm changes depending on the occasion. A funeral toll sounds different from a fire warning. A wedding bell is not the same as the wolves are in the sheep pen again bell. And if you mess that up, suddenly half the village is weeping and the other half is on fire. Also, the bells themselves? They weigh anywhere from a few dozen pounds to several hundred, depending on your village's budget and ambition. Pulling them takes strength, coordination, and a kind of stubborn defiance that only comes from surviving multiple lice infestations. Some bell towers had a full ring of multiple bells, maybe 5, maybe even 8, and each one needed to be rung in a particular order to create the correct peal. If you're imagining a lovely melodic chime, you're in the wrong century. This is more like orchestrated chaos. Like if Metallica played Gregorian chants while having a nervous breakdown. Now let's say, for the sake of immersion, that you are the bell ringer. You wake up every 2 hours. Always. Because you have a schedule. 7 church services a day, plus emergencies, plus festivals, plus if someone gets murdered again, you need to announce that too. You sleep in a corner with a wool blanket that smells like smoked turnip and despair. You eat whatever the priest drops off, usually leftover bread, sometimes suspicious stew. Your friends? You don't have any. They all got tired of you waking them up at 4 a.m. to tell them it's time to go pray in a freezing stone room. Your greatest joy in life? Ringing the bell a little bit late just to mess with people. And your greatest fear? That one day, the rope will snap mid-swing and the bell will crash down and flatten you like an ecclesiastical pancake. Fun fact, that actually happened. Bells fell. People died. More than once. Sometimes during casting, sometimes during swinging, sometimes just because gravity got bored and wanted a snack. Some churches even kept special rituals to protect the bell tower. They'd sprinkle holy water on it, say prayers, hang relics nearby, because everyone knew that bell was important and also that bell was dangerous. Now, back to you, the bell ringer. You're up before dawn. Again, you trudge up the creaky wooden ladder to your tower post, stepping over the resident cat, which is only half alive and fully untrustworthy. You reach for the rope. You give it a pull. But today, the bell doesn't ring. It groans. Because it's frozen. It's January. The tower is soaked with ice, and the bell, made of bronze, remember, is colder than your ex's heart. The clapper is stuck. You could try hitting it with a mallet. But last time you did that, you knocked out your front tooth and had to explain to the village blacksmith why you now whistle every time you breathe. So instead, you get clever. You light a small fire underneath it. Just enough to warm the metal. Which is great, until you realize that now the smoke is curling up into the belfry, where the birds have been nesting, and suddenly there's a flapping cloud of furious winged chaos trying to kill you. You ring the bell anyway, because you're a professional. Meanwhile, down below, the villagers have already gathered. Some with pitchforks, some with baskets. One man has brought a suspiciously large spoon, and no one asks why. They hear the bell. They act. Because the bell is law. It's how they know when to plant, when to harvest, when to gather for announcements, when to grieve, and most importantly, when to stop eating because Lent just started. Nothing ruins a roasted pig leg like the sudden, guilt-inducing toll of the fasting bell. There are bells for court, bells for markets, bells for when the ale is ready, which is very important, bells to start your penance, bells to remind you that someone, somewhere, did something sinful, and now we all have to feel vaguely bad about it. And the bell ringer? He knows all of it. Now, sometimes, on feast days or major celebrations, you get to do more than just pull a rope like a slightly damp human metronome. You get to coordinate with the choir. Maybe even ring in a full peal, a complex, mathematical sequence of bell tones that could last for hours. Imagine being in a freezing tower, pulling ropes in time with 7 other villagers, while a priest screams numbers at you and a raven pecks at your boot. That's called joy in the Middle Ages. And when the bell breaks, and it will, eventually, your job is to climb into the bell and inspect it. From the inside, while dangling from ropes, in a tower, during a windstorm. Because if there's one thing the medieval period excelled at, it was occupational hazards with zero safety net, literally or figuratively. The cracks are deadly. When a bell cracks, its tone changes. It loses its resonance. It becomes mournful, damaged. A cracked bell means bad luck. It means misfortune. It means someone in the village did something terrible, probably involving sheep, and now the bell is sad. If you're really lucky, the priest might demand a new bell, which means finding a bell founder, building a fire big enough to melt bronze, pouring it into a mold, and praying it doesn't explode and take out the church. So no pressure. And if you ever wonder, why put up with all this? Why does the bell ringer do it? Well, for one thing, he's exempt from a lot of other jobs. You don't get conscripted as often. You get housing, maybe a little stipend. And most importantly, you're left alone. You're weird, but you're useful. And in the medieval world, that's about as close to job security as you're going to get. So as you drift off now, eyes heavy, head resting against your burlap pillow filled with itchy lies, think about the man in the tower, the bell ringer, alone with his thoughts, his rope, and the clanging heartbeat of a village that never quite sleeps. He's already preparing for the next ring. Because dawn is coming. And so is Matins. It's Tuesday. Probably. You wouldn't know unless someone rang a bell. You blink awake, mouth dry, eyes crusted with the kind of medieval sleep that comes from drinking cloudy water and eating 3-day-old turnips. There's no rooster, no sunrise alarm, no helpful little clock next to your bed telling you it's 6:45 a.m. and time to ruin your day. Instead, ding. There it is. 1 chime. You wait. 2 more. That's it. That's your time signal. That's how you know it's time to wake up and pray. Again. For the 4th time in the last 12 hours. You're not even sure who you're praying to anymore. Just that if you don't, your neighbor with the lazy eye will tell the priest, and suddenly you're doing penance in a snowbank. Welcome to the world before clocks. Or, rather, a world where bells were your clocks, and also your calendar, and also your emotional support system. Except instead of therapy, it just yelled at you from a tower and reminded you that you were probably sinning. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to historical lectures delivered by someone who's read way too much about church bells. Leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Seriously, I love seeing who's out there. Are you in bed right now? On a train? Avoiding responsibility at 2:36 a.m.? I see you. Now, back to the bells. Before mechanical clocks were a thing, which they weren't, because gears hadn't quite gotten their act together yet, bells were the best and loudest way to tell people what time it was. Or at least what event it was. You didn't need to know it was 10 a.m., you needed to know it was terce, the 3rd canonical hour of the day. Which meant, of course, more prayer. Possibly singing. Definitely not brunch. The entire day was sliced up into holy sections. Matins. Lauds. Prime. Terce. Sext. None. Vespers. Compline. Sounds like a cursed Harry Potter spell book, but it's actually your daily rhythm. You probably didn't understand Latin, but you understood that if the bell rang in that particular pattern, it was time to put down your wooden spoon, wash your face in a bucket of regret, and stumble toward the church. This wasn't optional. These were auditory deadlines. You ignored them at your peril. And let's be clear, bells weren't just about time. Bells were about morality, about behavior, about surveillance. If the bell rang and you didn't show up, people noticed. And people in a medieval village noticing things is how rumors start and accusations fly, and suddenly you're being dunked in a river because someone thinks you're friends with Satan's goats. And the schedule? It never stopped. Here's a typical monastic day, which, by the way, deeply influenced village life. Midnight-ish, matins, wake up and pray. 3 a.m., lauds, pray again. You're already up, so why not? 6 a.m., prime, start your day, but also pray. 9 a.m., terce, time for mid-morning guilt. Noon, sext, lunch, sort of. But first, pray. 3 p.m., none, afternoon prayer/sleepwalking. 6 p.m., vespers, evening prayers. Again. 9 p.m., compline, final prayers before bed. If you make it. All signaled by bells. Every few hours. Like an anxious, religious version of a Fitbit. Except instead of reminding you to stretch or drink water, it reminds you that you're full of sin and need to kneel about it. And this system wasn't just for monks. Oh no. In villages attached to monasteries or cathedrals, which was most of them, this schedule leaked into daily life. Farmers would begin and end work based on bell patterns. Bakers timed their bread rising to bell cycles. Even marriages were scheduled around when the bell ringer could squeeze in your vows between vespers and ring the warning bell, because the miller lit something on fire again. The bell was your personal assistant, except louder and more passive-aggressive. Imagine you're sitting with your family, chewing on salted cabbage. Your wife is trying to keep the baby from licking the floor again. Your son is asking what the stars are. You, of course, have no idea. Then, dong. One long toll. You freeze. That's the fire bell. And now everyone's running. Buckets. Blankets. Someone is yelling something about candles and the pig shed. Your daughter is trying to save her doll, which is actually a lump of hay with a smile carved into it. It's chaos. And none of it would have started without the bell. But let's say it's not fire. Let's say it's market day. A cheerful, faster pattern. The kind that says bring your chickens, your barley, and your vaguely stolen apples. You head out, excited to trade. Maybe someone has cheese. Maybe you won't come home with fleas. Maybe this is the day you find a comb that doesn't give you splinters. Again, all triggered by bells. They controlled everything. The start of school. The end of court. The curfew. If you were out after dark and the bell rang the night watch, you better get home. Fast. Because otherwise you might meet the village constable. And he's had a bad week. And he's looking for someone to blame. There were even pestilence bells. When plague came to town, the bell was rung in a distinct, grim rhythm. Sometimes accompanied by incense or processions. Other times, just by weeping and the sound of shovels. These bells marked death, but also tried to chase it away. And you heard them a lot, especially in the 14th century. Because, spoilers, there was a lot of dying. Let's not forget the bells for war. When knights marched off to fight someone's cousin over a disagreement about sheep or crowns or papal taxes, the bells rang. Patriotic. Loud. Dramatic. People cheered. And then later, when only half the knights came back, bells again. Slower this time. Heavier. Sadder. Accompanied by the smell of wet leather and broken promises. Now, fast forward a little. You're older. Your knees hurt. Your favorite ox is dead. And you can still tell the time just by listening. You've internalized the bells so deeply that when the pattern shifts, even slightly, your whole body tenses. You feel it. Like a ghost memory. That, dear listener, is what bells did. They colonized your nervous system. They weren't just background noise. They trained you. Pavlov style. Except instead of dogs and treats, it was you and barley soup. And the irony? Most of the people who lived under this bell-dominated regime had no idea what time it actually was. Like, in numbers. Hours. Minutes. That wasn't the point. Time wasn't a math problem. It was a sequence of sound, light, and prayer. The modern obsession with punctuality, I'll be there at 4:15 sharp, would have made no sense. Bells didn't tell you to do things precisely at 9:37 a.m. They said, now-ish. Now it's time to work. Now it's time to beg forgiveness. Now it's time to stop pretending you're still praying and just go to bed. And the church, which owned the bells, rang the bells, interpreted the bells, controlled everything that followed. That's the deeper magic of it all. This wasn't just a scheduling tool. It was a power structure. Ring the bell, and people move. Obey. Assemble. Repent. And if you control that, you control the world. So next time your phone buzzes and you sigh because it's time for another pointless meeting, just remember, at least it's not a death bell. At least no one's demanding you wake up at midnight to sing Latin songs you don't understand in a room that smells like moss and desperation. And most importantly, at least your clock doesn't weigh 600 pounds and hang over your head like a literal instrument of God's judgment. Sleep tight. You've been chosen. You're the new bell ringer. Congratulations. It's not a job you asked for. It's not a job anyone asks for. But old Wilfred, the previous ringer, has gone and died in his sleep, which is rare, honestly, and now you've been volunteered by the priest, who was smiling far too much when he said it. So now you get to climb the ladder, the very tall, very splintery, extremely creaky ladder that leads to the church's bell chamber. And by chamber we mean a glorified pigeon coop with drafts, mold, and a high chance of sudden death via gravity. The bell is waiting, and it's huge, and it hates you. Its name is something dramatic like Maria Magna or St. Leonard's Maw, and it weighs more than 3 oxen stacked end to end. It has Latin inscriptions carved into its rim, something about divine wrath and peace, which feels like a weird combo, and it smells like rust, wax, and 300 years of damp prayer. And you're supposed to ring it by pulling a rope thicker than your thigh, through a pulley system designed by someone who clearly hated ergonomics and human spines. But first, before you even yank the rope, the tower shifts. Groans, really, as if it knows what's coming, as if the bell is alive, which, in a way, it kind of is. You've heard the stories. Of course, all medieval jobs were hazardous. Thatched roofing, good luck not falling. Tanner, hope you enjoy skinning things next to a bucket of boiling urine. But bell ringing had its own very special blend of misery. First, the sound. Standing next to a medieval church bell, as it rings, is not like hearing it from the village green. It is not peaceful. It is not charming. It does not gently remind you of God's presence. It tries to murder your eardrums. The sound is deafening. Not loud concert deafening. Weaponized thunder deafening. The vibrations hit you in the bones. Your chest rattles. Your teeth feel loose. Your ears go hot and then numb. It's like being shouted at by a brass god with anger issues. And because this is the Middle Ages, you have no ear protection. No noise-canceling headphones. No OSHA regulations. Just you, a big rope, a bell with abandonment issues, and the ambient smell of old wood and pigeon guano. After a few years of this, you'll be almost completely deaf. Everyone in town will think you're possessed or stupid. You won't hear your name anymore, or the soft rain on the chapel roof, or your own children begging you to stop ringing the bells in your sleep. Because yes, that's another thing. Bell ringing gets into you. The rhythm, the feel, the schedule. You'll start dreaming in chimes. You'll twitch every time you hear a bell toll, even if it's just someone dropping a cup. Your muscles will remember the weight and pull of the rope, even after you've quit, or gone mad, or both, which is, historically, a real thing. Medieval bell ringers were often considered a little unstable. Not evil, just sort of shaky. They spent too much time alone in towers. Too much time with God's angry music box. Too much time looking down on a village they were slowly growing to despise. Because here's the truth, bell ringers didn't just ring the bell. They cleaned it, maintained it, guarded it from birds, ice, and drunken teenagers trying to carve rude things into the woodwork. They often lived in the tower, in a small, cold loft with a rope that bisected the floor and a mattress made of straw and regret. They had one job, make sure the bell tolled. No matter the weather, no matter how sick they were, no matter who died. If it was Sunday, or Matins, or plague warning o'clock, they pulled a rope. Or else, missed the tolling, and you didn't just make people late, you risked the wrath of the priest. Or worse, the wrath of the townsfolk, who now think you caused a bad harvest because you didn't ring the St. Michael Protect Us bell on time. Never mind the fact that you had a fever and fell down the stairs. Oh, and did we mention the stairs? Because medieval bell towers were not built with safety in mind. They were built by masons who hated floors and loved the idea of just enough stability to maybe not die. You climbed steep, narrow steps, sometimes just pegs hammered into the wall, in the dark, in the cold, while holding a lantern that might set your sleeve on fire. It's romantic, right? But wait, there's more. Let's talk about bell founding. Because someone had to make these bells. And oh boy, what a process. First, you dig a pit. A big pit. In the middle of town. You fill it with clay molds, shaped like bells, coated in wax, carefully inscribed. You mix the metals, mostly bronze, a little tin, sometimes silver if the parish had deep pockets. Then you melt it. In a massive, open furnace. Did I mention this is all happening with zero safety gear? You're pouring molten metal into a pit, while chickens watch and children dance around the edges. If the bell cracks during cooling, tough luck. Start over. If it's too soft, sounds like a dinner plate. Too hard, shatters like your expectations. Sometimes, people fell in. Yeah, that happened. There's a story from 14th century France about a novice bell founder who got too close to the pit during a pour, tripped, and became a permanent part of St. Cuthbert's joy. The townsfolk kept ringing it anyway. Some said it had a richer tone. And then, after the bell was cast and blessed and hoisted into place using winches, prayer, and 6 terrified oxen, you hoped it would stay there. Medieval churches were famous for collapsing spires and wobbling towers. Bells fell, sometimes while ringing. Imagine it, you're walking to Mass, half asleep, thinking about barley taxes, and then THWAM, instant sainthood, death by divine percussion. So yes, being a bell ringer, or a bell founder, or even a guy who walks near bells, was a risky job. But it came with weird perks. Some towns treated bell ringers like minor celebrities. After all, they kept the village running. They were the ones who tolled for baptisms, marriages, funerals, and festivals. They were the audio glue holding society together. And in exchange, they got free beer. Sometimes. That's not a joke. In many towns, the bell ringer received a daily ration of ale. For hydration, obviously. Also bread. Maybe cheese, if the priest was feeling generous. But mostly beer. Because nothing says reliable timekeeping like getting slightly drunk before climbing a wobbly tower to yank on a swinging death machine. There were rituals, too. Superstitions. Bell ringers often said a prayer before each ring or made the sign of the cross with the rope. Some kissed the bell. Others swore never to touch the clapper with bare hands. And if a bird died in the tower, that was bad luck. Very bad. But worst of all, the silence. Because every bell, eventually, stops ringing. Sometimes for repairs. Sometimes because the village couldn't afford upkeep. Sometimes because the ringer died and no one wanted the job. And then the bell just sits there, high above the town, forgotten, covered in cobwebs, listening. And villagers would whisper, "That's the ghost bell," they'd say. It rings on its own, only during storms, or funerals, or when someone lies. It's just wind, of course, or settling stone. But in a world where noise was sacred and bells were the voice of heaven, silence was terrifying. And for the bell ringer who spent a lifetime pulling ropes, bruising palms, losing hearing, sleeping alone with the pigeons, that silence wasn't peace. It was absence. The kind that echoes in your bones long after the bell stops. Sleep well. You're eating lunch. Well, calling it lunch is generous. It's more of a barley blob with a chunk of salted mystery meat and some wilted greens pretending to be lettuce. But it's warm. Mostly. And your hands aren't shaking anymore. So that's a win. Then it rings. You pause, spoon halfway to your mouth. That wasn't the midday bell. That was sharper. Shorter. Almost clipped, like the bell itself was irritated. 3 short tolls. A pause. 3 more. You blink. Ah, someone's died. You don't even need to ask who. You'll hear soon enough. Probably from Agnes the weaver's daughter who somehow knows everything before it happens. But the bell? The bell has already told you all it wants to. You just have to speak bell. Because medieval villages didn't just have a bell. Oh no. That would be far too simple. They had an entire bell lexicon. A clang-based Morse code, perfected over centuries. A bell for waking. A bell for meals. A bell for deaths. For fire. For debt collection. For gathering arms in case the bishop got drunk and declared a holy war again. The bell spoke. And you, like everyone else in the village, listened. So, let's do a little crash course in bell fluency. If you've ever wanted to become conversationally fluent in clang, now's your chance. Because if you don't learn what each bell means, you'll end up showing up to a funeral in your bathing tunic. Again, let's start with the basics. There's the Matins bell, usually rung before sunrise. It says, time to pray. Or at least pretend you're praying while you yawn through half a psalm. Then there's the Angelus bell. It rings 3 times a day, dawn, noon, and dusk. Its job is to remind you that angels exist and that you're probably not one of them. It's short, tidy, and sounds smug. The curfew bell tells you it's time to put out the fire. Yes, really. Curfew comes from couvre-feu, French for cover the fire. Because in your thatch-roofed wooden town, leaving a fire unattended is like storing dynamite in a fireplace. So the bell rings. You smother the coals. You hope the rats don't return. There's the work bell, rung at dawn, or just before the first fieldwork begins. Think of it as the medieval version of your 6 a.m. alarm, except it doesn't have a snooze button. Just existential dread and rope burn. But those are just the day-to-day bells. Let's get to the juicy ones. The death knell. This one you recognize instantly. It's deep, heavy, slower than the usual tolls. It hangs in the air like fog. The moment you hear it, your stomach drops a little, not necessarily because someone you love has died, but because you hope it's not someone important, like the miller, or your only friend who doesn't smell like pickled fish. Fun fact, depending on the village, the death bell sounded differently for men and women. 2 tolls for a woman, 3 for a man. And if it was a child, a single high-pitched bell called the passing bell. Because of course, why wouldn't they add emotional trauma to timekeeping? And sometimes, just to really twist the knife, they'd ring what was called the corpse bell as the funeral procession passed through the streets. As if the grieving family didn't already know. Then there's the fire bell. This one rings in panic. Rapid, uneven tolls. It doesn't toll, it shrieks. The sound alone is enough to make you throw on your least flammable shirt and start running toward the church or wherever the smoke's thickest. No one ignores this one. Because if your neighbor's cottage is on fire, yours probably is too. Timber towns don't burn, they erase themselves. What about the war bell? Yes, that's real. It's not used often, thank God. But when it is, oh boy, it's loud. It's fast. It sounds like the bell's being attacked. Probably because it is. Someone's pulling that rope like their life depends on it. Because it might. This is the bell you hear when raiders approach. Or when the local baron decides he wants to practice feudalism on your chickens. Again, some villages had the debt bell. A short, aggressive clang followed by silence. The financial equivalent of someone knocking on your door, asking, "Where's my money, Gregor?" It was used to summon debtors to the church or town square. Imagine being called out in front of the whole town via bell. It's like being subtweeted by a building. There's also the leper bell. Not rung from a tower, this one was handheld. Used by lepers themselves as a kind of biological warning system. Hey, I have an incurable and highly contagious disease. Please avoid breathing on me. Or near me. Or ever. If that seems harsh, remember, this was a society where illnesses were seen as divine punishment. So the bell wasn't just practical, it was theological. You weren't just sick, you were being punished by God, and now you had to ring your shame everywhere you went. And then, perhaps weirdest of all, the meal bell. Sometimes it was rung at monasteries, sometimes in villages during festivals. It told people it was time to eat, or stop eating, or show up for charity bread if you were lucky and not currently excommunicated. But this wasn't a cute dinner bell. This was a full, grim toll that said, your gruel awaits. If you're imagining a sweet little chime, no. Think, you've earned a half bowl of cabbage broth and a stale hunk of wheat that survived 3 weevil infestations. Every bell had meaning. Every tone, every rhythm, every pause between tolls told story. If you lived in a village long enough, you learned the bell's whole vocabulary. So when the death bell tolled twice, paused, and tolled again, you knew. It's a woman. Probably old. Maybe old Agnes. Or not. Maybe the midwife. You'd hear whispers by dusk. Someone would send a child with news. But the bell told you first. And this system worked incredibly well, considering no one had a watch, a calendar, or even a consistent concept of time. Why? Because time in a medieval village was communal. It wasn't about minutes or appointments. It was about moments. The bell didn't tell you, it's 7:42 a.m. It told you, now we rise. Now we pray. Now we mourn. And that's what made bells powerful. They were more than just sound. They were social glue, psychological scaffolding. The voice of the village, loud, metallic, slightly off-key, but somehow comforting. Until they weren't. Because sometimes the bell didn't ring. And when that happened, when the village heard nothing, people noticed. People worried. A silent bell was a bad omen. A sign something had gone wrong. A broken rope. A collapsed tower. A ringer who'd gone missing in the night. Silence was scary. In the medieval mind, noise was life. Chanting. Hammering. Prayers. Wind. Cows. Children. Bells. When the bell fell silent, it was like the town itself had stopped breathing. So yes, bells had a lot of jobs. More than you'd think for a giant upside-down cup that hangs in the sky and screams on command. And now that you speak bell, you'll never hear them the same way again. Sleep tight. You wake up with a start. Not from a scream, or a rooster, or a vision of sin involving Brother Thomas and an overripe pear. No, it's the bell again. Except this time, it didn't ring. It exploded. Not literally. Not yet. But you've been in this village long enough to know the sound of a healthy bell, and this one is not it. It rang once. Then again, but more like a cough. Then silence. Then a deep metallic groan. You could feel it in your teeth. A sound like the church tower just gave up. You blink through the candlelit haze. You sniff. No fire. Not yet. But the tower's bell hasn't rung right in weeks. Maybe the clapper's loose. Maybe the ringer's drunk again. Or maybe, and here's the real fun thought, the bell itself is about to fall. You roll over and think, wouldn't be the worst way to go. Crushed by salvation. And truly, that was not as rare as it should have been. Let's talk about bell disasters. Yes, they existed. Yes, they were as chaotic and weirdly specific as you'd hope. And yes, they almost always involved fire, poor craftsmanship, God, or some guy named Bertram who swore he knew what he was doing. We start, as all tragedies do, with molten metal. Because bells don't grow on trees. They are cast. By bellfounders. A noble trade, if you like your work loud and incredibly dangerous. Bellfounding in the Middle Ages was a bizarre mix of science, superstition, and blind optimism. You'd need a mold made of loam, clay, cow hair, and occasionally horse dung, because why not? Then you'd build a furnace, melt down a terrifying amount of bronze, and pour it into the mold, ideally without accidentally burning down your town. The mixture was usually around 78% copper and 22% tin, the standard medieval alloy for a sweet tone. If you added too much tin, the bell would be brittle. Too little, and it'd sound like a wet boot hitting a chamber pot. This was not casual work. Bellfinders had to calculate the thickness of the bell's lip, the size of the clapper, and the curvature of the mouth, all without math as we know it. No calculators. No digital schematics. Just experience, prayers, and an unhealthy level of confidence. And when they screwed up, they didn't get a bad review. They got a collapse. Sometimes the bell cracked on the first ring. Sometimes it sounded wrong, like a dying goose wrapped in tinfoil. Sometimes it rang fine, until one day, mid-ceremony, it ripped itself from the yoke and dropped 50 feet through the belfry floor, killing the priest, a goat, and 2 visiting nobles from the north. This happened. One of the most famous bell-related deaths occurred in England in the 1700s, a little later than our usual window, but still medieval in spirit. A bell ringer died when the rope wrapped around his neck and yoinked him into the air. Instant strangulation. The moral? Never trust gravity, especially when it's attached to 2,000 pounds of divine bronze. Let's rewind, though. Because before a bell ever got to a tower, it had to survive its birth. Imagine standing next to a medieval furnace, the heat enough to melt your eyebrows, as you watch several hundred pounds of liquid metal hiss its way into a mold. If the mold cracks, boom. If air gets trapped, boom. If someone sneezes too hard, probably boom. People treated bell-founding days like religious festivals. Which is ironic, because they often ended in apocalyptic horror. There's one story, possibly apocryphal, but juicy enough to share, about a French bell called Jean le Grinch's, Jean the Grumpy. It was commissioned by a wealthy abbot who wanted a bell that would sing the voice of heaven. Instead, they got a bell that sounded like it was vomiting metal. The tone was off, the clapper too small. The yoke cracked within weeks. Then, 2 months after installation, it shattered during Mass, raining bronze shards onto terrified monks like some kind of ecclesiastical shrapnel. They declared the bell cursed. Someone tried to baptize it. Someone else suggested marrying it to a nicer bell. Eventually, they melted it down and used the bronze to make spoons. Divine vengeance, now in cutlery form. And then there were the freak weather incidents. Did you know lightning is attracted to bells? Not metaphorically. Literally. Bells hang in towers. Towers are tall. Lightning loves height. So when the sky gets frisky, guess who's first in line for divine zapping? Exactly. It was such a known problem that bell towers often had iron crosses or rods on top. Not for decoration, for deflection. One unlucky spark and your precious bell could crack right down the center, like an egg dropped by an angry god. There's even a medieval superstition that ringing a bell during a storm could scare away the lightning. That's right, monks would deliberately ring the tower bell in the middle of thunderstorms, convinced that the sound would banish evil spirits. There's no way this could backfire. Spoiler, it did. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, dozens of bell ringers across Europe were electrocuted while trying to ring the storm away. Many churches eventually banned the practice, not because it wasn't working, but because they were running out of monks. And if you think that's grim, wait until you hear about the falling bell of Nuremberg. Sometime in the late 13th century, in what is now southern Germany, a bell tower collapsed due to poor foundation maintenance. Entire structure just gave up. One of the bells fell clean out of the tower, bounced off the roof of a bakery, and flattened a passing ox cart. Miraculously, no one died. But the bell cracked, lost its voice, and was buried ceremonially outside town as the bell that would not behave. Medieval villagers were nothing if not dramatic. But despite all this chaos, all the collapses, the electrocutions, the spontaneous bronze betrayals, the bell remained sacred. Loved, feared, respected, because it wasn't just a tool. It was a presence. Something about its sheer size and sound made people think of it as alive. You didn't install a bell. You invited it. You named it, baptized it, gave it godparents, sprinkled it with holy water. You threw feasts when it arrived and processions when it was raised. You didn't own the bell. The bell owned you. And when it rang, you listened. Of course, not all bells were giant metal death frisbees. Some were small, personal, friendly, even. Handbells were used in daily life, by monks to signal prayer changes, by lepers to warn of their presence, by town criers to get attention before shouting the medieval equivalent of breaking news, which usually meant someone stole a pig or a bishop got caught doing bishop things. But even the small bells had weight, in both the literal and symbolic sense. Because whether it was a handbell or a cathedral chime, a bell meant order, structure, a kind of musical scaffolding for a world perpetually teetering on the edge of chaos. It rang to tell you when to wake, when to sleep, when to pray, when to flee, and when to mourn. It was your clock, your alarm, your emergency broadcast system, and your village gossip all rolled into one. And sometimes, very occasionally, your executioner. So the next time you hear a bell in the distance, maybe from a church or a tower or some oddly dramatic doorbell system, take a moment, breathe, listen, and thank your lucky stars it didn't fall on your head. You wake up in the dead of night. The wind is moaning like a dying sheep in a confession booth, and the only light is from your hearth, barely a whisper of embers, glowing faintly under ash. Then you hear it. Ding. Not a real bell. A small one. A tink. Like a coin dropped into an empty grave. And you know instantly, it's the bad kind of bell. You don't remember when it started, exactly. The bell that rings with no ringer. The sound no one else hears. But every time it comes, something goes wrong. A fever. A missing cow. That time the local brewer accidentally invented skunk beer, and half the village had visions of Saint Apollonia screaming. Coincidence? Not according to literally everyone in your village. Because bells, for all their holiness and harmony, were also deeply, profoundly haunted. Welcome to the weird and superstitious world of bell magic, bell curses, and auditory exorcisms. Let's start with something cheerful. Hell. Medieval Christians believed that bells had power beyond the physical. You know, in case giant vibrating metal voice of God wasn't enough. Bells were thought to scare off demons, prevent storms, cure plague, and possibly help dead souls transition to heaven, like spiritual Uber drivers made of bronze in desperation. This belief was so strong that churches began baptizing bells. Yes, like humans. They gave them names, poured holy water on them, rubbed them in oil, gave them ceremonial godparents. And when they were done, they didn't say, "All right, let's raise the bell." They said, "Let us lift him into the tower." Because obviously, now the bell has a soul. You know, like Gary, the 1,500-pound guardian of the nave. And Gary was not to be messed with. These baptisms were elaborate, often more festive than actual baby christenings. Bells were sprinkled with salt to ward off evil. They were censed with incense, anointed with sacred oils, and blessed with words like, "May this bell put to flight the power of storms and winds, the demons of the air, the disturbances of tempests, and all spirits of the enemy." Which is a very polite way of saying, "Ding dong, the demon's gone." Churches poured serious money into these rituals, often equivalent to a year's wages for a skilled laborer. Because if your bell was spiritually compromised, it could bring more than bad sound. It could bring bad luck. There were even stories, whispered late at night, of cursed bells. Bells that tolled on their own. Bells that refused to ring during weddings, but screamed like banshees for funerals. Bells that cracked during Mass, or chimed backwards, or rang with voices in their tone. You know, classic medieval nightmare fuel. One such bell, from the Benedictine Abbey of St. Benoît-sur-Loire, was known for tolling just before a disaster. Fire, flood, plague, peasant revolt didn't matter. It would ring. No rope, no hand. Just a low, solemn boom in the dead of night. The monks called it the sigh of the tower. Which sounds poetic until it happens while you're in the privy. But don't worry, the superstition got weirder. In parts of medieval Germany and France, people believed bells could prevent crop failure. So during droughts, villagers would ring small handbells while walking around fields, chanting half-biblical nonsense and begging the soil to cooperate. Did it work? No. But it made them feel better and gave the bell ringers something to do besides quietly panic about starvation. And then there's the charming practice of death knells. You've probably heard the phrase, "For whom the bell tolls," right? Spoiler, it's you. Always you. In medieval villages, when someone died or was about to, the bell would ring in a very specific pattern. A death knell wasn't just an obituary in sound form. It was a signal to the entire village. One toll for a child, 2 for a woman, 3 for a man. Sometimes followed by a series of chimes matching the person's age. You could be sitting at breakfast, happily gnawing on a crust of sadness, when you'd hear, ding, ding, ding. Pause. Toll, 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 toll. You'd count 10 tolls. That's Brother Matthew. He was 40 last we checked. Add the pattern. Yep, he's dead. Someone tell the sheik. These knells were believed to guide the soul to the afterlife. But if rung incorrectly, out of rhythm, at the wrong hour, or by someone untrained, it could trap the soul, or worse, invite unwanted guests. Which brings us to demons and exorcisms by bell. The belief in demonic possession was real. Like, this person is sick because Satan is inside their spleen, real. And while priests had various tools for removing the uninvited, holy water, relics, threats of Latin chanting, bells were often used to cleanse the space. Not because demons hated noise. Because they hated order. To the medieval mind, a bell's perfect tone represented divine structure. It was harmony incarnate. Demons, being creatures of chaos, could not bear it. So you'd see priests ringing small handbells during exorcisms or spiritual cleansings, sometimes around homes, sometimes inside the homes, and occasionally around livestock, because even cows needed protection from Satan. And bells were portable. Unlike your priest, who had arthritis, they were even used in personal spiritual kits. Like little medieval demon bug sprays. But what if a bell itself became cursed? Oh yes, this happened, too. particularly during wars, when churches were desecrated and bells were stolen, broken, or used in very unholy ways, like melting them down to make cannons. There was a widespread belief that violated bells that had been unblessed, broken, or misused, could become vessels for evil. Some people buried them. Others rebaptized them. One bishop in 1293 ordered a bell that had been profaned by pagan hands to be broken into pieces, the fragments scattered across 7 rivers, and then ritually forgotten. You know, just in case one fragment reassembled itself into a demon at some later date. So yes, bells weren't just practical. They were magical, dangerous, sacred, haunted, and sometimes deeply, absurdly human. Because for every tale of exorcising devils with sound, there were 100 more about villagers who misunderstood why the bell was ringing. Like the story of a 12th century Welsh village where the bell rang 3 times every night, and the locals assumed it was an evil spirit. Turned out it was a drunken sexton who'd sleepwalked to the tower after too much mead. Or the one about a bell in Hungary that rang every time someone lied. Spoiler, it didn't. People just assumed it did. And the result was several failed marriages, a goat trial, and one surprisingly honest blacksmith. And still, through all the chaos, the mystery, and the melodrama, bells endured. Because even in their darkest legends, they stood for control. In a world of disease, death, war, and unpredictable goats, a bell was something you could hear, something you could measure. A sound that meant you were not alone, even if the sound came at midnight and no one else was near the tower. Sleep well with that thought. In the last chapter, we discovered that medieval bells weren't just spiritual sound systems. They were also potential exorcism devices, soul elevators, and general-purpose ghost deterrents. But now, we're going to talk about something far more terrifying than demons. Money. More specifically, the massive, brain-melting cost of owning and operating a bell in a medieval village. Because if you thought college tuition was bad, try buying a 6-foot bronze behemoth with the acoustic range of a military-grade foghorn using 14th century peasant cash. You wake up at sunrise. Again. Because this is the Middle Ages, and the only other option is dying in your sleep from fever and poor ventilation. You're a humble member of a sleepy hamlet in northern France. Maybe 300 people, 3 cows, 1 priest, and 0 ambitions of being invaded this decade. But Father Bernard, the local cleric with severe opinions about sin and soup, has just informed the village that it's time to get a bell. God demands it, he says. Also, the bishop wrote a letter, and Bernard really wants to climb the local ecclesiastical rankings. But there's one problem: bells are absurdly expensive. Not can we fundraise a little and see, expensive. Try we must tax every household, pawn the church candlesticks, slaughter the festival pig, and beg a nearby monastery for financial aid, expensive. Because making a bell in the medieval period wasn't just a shopping trip, it was a giant metal miracle, made possible by engineering, alchemy, and financial trauma. Let's break it down, shall we? First, the raw materials. To cast even a modest bell, let's say 300 kilograms, which is about the size of a nice dinner bell for a medium-sized apocalypse, you'd need a bronze alloy, roughly 80% copper, 20% tin. That amount of metal? In the 1300s? Good luck. Copper had to be mined, smelted, refined, and transported, often from miles away. Tin wasn't exactly growing on trees either. And don't forget the mold, which meant building a temporary furnace in a large clan dung, cast the size of a wine barrel, that took weeks to prepare and frequently exploded. Artisans who specialized in this were called bellfondas, and they were like medieval rock stars, or at least the acoustic engineers of their time. Highly skilled, highly mobile, and very, very expensive. So how much did all this cost? Well, historical records suggest that a mid-sized church bell could cost between 30 to 60 pounds sterling in the 13th century. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of several years' income for a skilled tradesman, or roughly 10 good cows, or a third of your village's annual budget, assuming no one breaks a leg or burns the grain stores again. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoyed this weird, sleepy little corner of medieval chaos. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always surreal seeing people across the globe collectively trying to pass out while hearing about ancient economic collapse. Now, back to bells. In many cases, the money didn't come from the church directly. It came from the villagers, through taxes, donations, or, and this is my personal favorite, mandatory spiritual bribes. Sometimes the local lord would front the money in exchange for eternal divine favor, which was shorthand for "please don't let me die horribly in battle this year." Other times, wealthy villagers would contribute chunks of their estate, not out of generosity, but because donating toward a bell was seen as a ticket to heaven. A typical donation might sound like this. "I, Geoffrey the baker, do bequeath unto the Holy Church 1 ox, 3 sacks of barley, and my wife's best ladle, that I might be remembered by God and spared the eternal fire." Charming, and somewhat tax-deductible. Then there was the public fundraising method. A bell ringer, or sometimes a young cleric, would go door to door with a handbell, ringing it loudly while explaining the need for the new tower bell. It was kind of like a medieval Kickstarter. Only instead of backer rewards, you got the warm, fuzzy feeling that you helped slightly reduce the risk of hellfire for the community. And God might forgive you for stealing that turnip last Tuesday. Of course, even after funding was secured, you still had to transport the bell. Remember, this isn't an Amazon Prime situation. There's no flat-rate shipping. You're moving a literal ton of cast metal across unpaved roads using oxen, carts, prayer, and the constant threat of catastrophic tipping. There are entire chronicles about bells getting stuck in the mud or falling off bridges or being lost in the forest by bandits who just wanted to melt them down and buy mead. One Flemish village reportedly spent more on transporting the bell than casting it. And then, finally, the bell arrives. Cue the feast, the prayers, the procession, the part where everyone touches it reverently, as if it's a newly crowned king made of bronze and sweat. Then it gets hauled up the tower using ropes, pulleys, and a terrifying amount of medieval optimism. Some towers weren't even structurally prepared for a bell that size, so a few villages had to rebuild the belfry entirely, leading to another round of fundraising, financial agony, and low-key divine bargaining. And God forbid, literally, if the bell cracked during installation, because then you're looking at a total loss. A cracked bell sounds awful, like a dying whale with bronchitis. It's unusable, and there's no patching it. You have to recast it from scratch, which means more money, more clay molds, and more soul-crushing trips to the copper mine. Some villages couldn't afford to try again. They'd mount the cracked bell anyway and just pretend it sounded fine. Yes, Brother Matthew, I meant for the noon prayer to sound like Satan gargling soup. Now, for a brief moment, let's talk about bell insurance. That's not a joke. There were actual contracts, some verbal, some written, where bell founders guaranteed the bell would sound good. If it cracked or rang poorly within a certain number of months, the founder had to replace or repair it for free, which led to some creative problem-solving. Some bell founders fled town before the testing. Others insisted the weird tone was intentional. One Italian record describes a bell that made a high-pitched shriek whenever it was rung, and the founder claimed it was a style favored by angels. The angels, in response, remained noticeably silent. Eventually, if the bell survived the first year, it became a part of the village's identity. Engraved, blessed, named, celebrated. But it was also guarded. During wars or invasions, bells were prime targets. They were valuable, symbolic, and made excellent scrap metal for weapons. So some towns hid their bells, burying them, masking them in hay, or even lowering them into wells. A few chroniclers mention bells being spirited away to monasteries deep in the mountains for safekeeping. This level of paranoia tells you something important. The bell was not just a tool. It was a treasure. It was a sign that your village mattered, that it had faith, order, and enough spare coin to make a musical cannonball in God's name. And that maybe, just maybe, you'd hear the sound of community, warning, or worship instead of nothing at all. Because the only thing worse than a cracked bell? No bell. Now that we've mortgaged the grain silos and sacrificed a few goats, socially, not literally, we're not in a Viking village, to buy our giant bronze bell. It's time to talk about something arguably messier than funding. People. You see, it's one thing to build a bell. It's another thing entirely to trust someone to ring it without breaking it, the tower, or the fragile fabric of communal sanity. This is where we enter the slightly chaotic world of medieval bell ringers, also known as campanarii, sign-aiders, or that guy with the weird shoulders and the permanent cough. You'd think it was a straightforward job, right? Climb up a ladder. Pull a rope. Ding. Done. Yeah, no. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where even rope pulling was a high-stakes, socially delicate act of sweaty politics and occasional vengeance. Let's begin by waking up as the bell ringer of your sleepy village. You're not exactly respected. You're not exactly hated. You exist in that fuzzy medieval middle ground, vital yet suspiciously unpaid. Your job? Wake up before everyone else. Climb 70 narrow stairs while dodging bats and sealing mold. Grab a rope the width of your thigh. Pull hard enough to lift half a cow. And do this several times a day, every day, even when you're sick, drunk, injured, or on fire. Yes, on fire. There's a documented case of a bell ringer continuing his duties during a church fire. Priorities. So before we really dig in, and before you fall asleep for real, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying this gentle descent into historical absurdity. And please, let me know in the comments what time it is for you, and where in the world you're listening from. I genuinely love seeing how global this sleepy cult of odd knowledge has become. Now, back to the bell ropes and the poor souls yanking them. Here's the thing most people forget: bells don't ring themselves. At least, not back then. No motors. No automatic chimes. No buttons. So, someone had to climb up and manually operate the thing, and depending on the size of the bell, this was either a one-person job or a whole team effort, complete with coordination, rhythm, and shouting. It's like CrossFit, but for Jesus. The bell ringer was often a low-ranking cleric or a layperson appointed by the parish. Occasionally, the village council would hire someone, usually a local who was strong, available, and not already consumed by plague or jury duty, which in medieval terms usually meant fighting off wolves. Sometimes, it was considered an honorary job, a way for someone to feel useful without needing to read Latin or interpret dreams. But more often than not, it was just hard labor. Thankless, exhausting, and vaguely humiliating. Because ringing a large bell wasn't just a matter of giving it a tug. No, you had to control the swinging, time the intervals, adjust for wind, and hope to God you didn't yank the rope so hard it broke free and killed a pigeon midair. In fact, bell ringing was so intense that some churches actually had written manuals about when and how to ring, including detailed instructions for tone, frequency, and the meaning of each pattern. 1 ring for prayer. 2 rings for curfew. 3 slow tolls for death. 1 long one for "Oh God, the bakery's on fire again." It was a medieval Morse code, and the bell ringer had to memorize the whole emotional language. Which brings us to the next delightful detail: the politics. You see, when you give one person the power to control the town's soundscape, to literally shape people's understanding of time, death, weather, and religious obligation, you are giving them more than just a rope. You're giving them social ammunition. Bell ringers were occasionally accused of abusing their power. Ring the death bell too early? Panic. Ring the curfew bell late? Chaos. Ring the prayer bell too many times? Everyone assumes someone sinned horribly, and now you've accidentally kicked off a witch hunt. And if the bell ringer didn't like someone? Let's just say it was possible to ring the bell at awkward times. Oh, is that your wedding? Enjoy the funeral toll instead. It got so bad in some towns that bell ringers were expected to swear oaths, actual spiritual contracts, promising not to ring the bell with wrath or mischief. That's an actual phrase from a 14th century church record. Yes, wrath, mischief. The two things most bell ringers apparently couldn't resist. Now let's talk about injury. Because nothing says devotion like a man falling out of a bell tower because the rope snapped or the floorboards gave way. Some bells required you to ride the rope. That's right, use your body weight to control the arc, lifting off the ground each time the bell swung. It looked kind of cool, in a medieval circus way. It was also responsible for more concussions than you'd expect. And those with smaller bells? Still dangerous. The motion caused chronic joint pain, burned palms, and nerve damage from gripping the rope too tightly. Rope burn wasn't just a side effect. It was practically a rite of passage. There are records of bell ringers developing calluses the size of coins and being given medicinal salves as part of their compensation. If you got really good, they might even toss in an old cloak or half a cheese as a bonus. And speaking of compensation, it varied wildly. Some were paid in coins, others in food, others in what I like to call moral encouragement, which is medieval for nothing. A few even had housing benefits, tiny rooms near or inside the church tower. Imagine living under a 500-pound bell and being startled awake by your own job every morning. Fun. Sometimes, bell ringers shared duties with the watchman, especially if the bell was used for town alarms. So you'd spend part of the night ringing, part of it watching for fires, and the rest questioning your life choices in a freezing stone turret with a cracked mug of ale. But perhaps the most fascinating thing? There were bell ringer guilds. Especially in larger towns or cities, bell ringing was so important it became a recognized trade. Members trained apprentices, taught techniques, maintained ropes and clappers, and occasionally fought with clergy about wages or ring schedules. There are actual lawsuits recorded where bell ringers argued with priests about inappropriate peal lengths and misuse of tone. One church in Germany reportedly banned a bell ringer for ringing excessively and with pride. Imagine being fired for ringing too proudly. Iconic. Of course, it wasn't all conflict. In some towns, bell ringers were local heroes, called upon for ceremonies, festivals, or important announcements. But more often than not, they lived somewhere between honored servant and perpetual sound janitor. They were the last to sleep, the first to rise, the ones who kept time moving when clocks failed, and who gave voice to tragedy and joy alike. And yet, most went unnamed. We know their work. We hear their legacy. But their names? Lost to the echoes. So next time you hear a bell in the distance, church, tower, or even a ringtone, spare a thought for the person who once had to climb a ladder with bad shoes and pull a damp rope at 4 a.m. while pigeons judged him from the rafters. At this point in our journey, we've done it all. We've climbed the rickety bell tower, yanked on the half-frozen rope, misfired the death knell, gotten sued for ringing too proudly, and probably have an unholy crick in the neck. We've endured financial ruin, fire hazards, pigeon judgment, and medieval bureaucracy. So you'd be forgiven for assuming things couldn't possibly get more intense. But you'd be wrong. Because today, we move from bell survival to bell performance. Yes, somehow, despite everything, the damp, the disease, the rampant superstition, humans managed to turn bell ringing into an art. A genuine, structured, musically complex, showboating art form. Because if there's one thing humans are better at than destroying things, it's loudly and publicly trying to outdo their neighbors with bronze. You see, bells weren't just signals or prayers anymore. By the late medieval period, and increasingly into the Renaissance, they became instruments. Not just one bell, but whole sets of bells, carefully tuned and arranged to play melodies. Yes, melodies. Songs. Concertos for people with zero other options for entertainment and a high tolerance for headache. Enter change ringing. But before we deep dive into that ringing rabbit hole, go ahead and take a moment, if you're not asleep yet, to like the video, subscribe if you're finding this the right blend of sleepy and strange, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I especially want to hear from those of you who have accidentally become nocturnal. You're not alone. Back to the bells. So, what exactly is change ringing? It's a form of bell music where a series of bells are rung in a very specific sequence, not to play a recognizable tune, but to cycle through all possible orders of those bells. It's like musical math, or auditory Sudoku, or a puzzle designed by someone who hated silence. Change ringing was especially popular in England, where whole bell towers were designed specifically to accommodate these multi-bell symphonies. Imagine 7 or 8 enormous bells, each with its own dedicated ringer, arranged in a tower like an acoustic war room. And now imagine those ringers pulling their ropes in a precisely timed pattern, each bell sounding in an evolving, mathematically arranged sequence. No two rounds are the same. The combinations can go into the tens of thousands. And the goal? Perfection. Timing. Control. Endurance. Some change ringing performances could last hours. Literally hours of synchronized bell pulling, with no bathroom breaks, no do-overs, and no mercy for the poor villagers trying to nap during the extended performance in D minor featuring anxiety and forearm cramps. This wasn't casual bell tolling. It was elite musical sport. Participants trained like athletes. They had guilds, uniforms, and manuals. They memorized sequences with names like Grandsire triples, Cambridgeshire prize major, and Stedman doubles, all of which sound like terrible Victorian cocktails, but are actually real, historic ringing patterns. And they weren't done in solitude. Oh no, villages would gather to watch the bell ringers. Not because you could see much, they were in the tower, after all, but because it became a kind of status event. People came to listen, to judge, to gossip, and to rate the local bell team like it was the medieval version of a dance competition. She's got lovely tone, but the transitions were late. I heard the sexton's boy missed his hand stroke. Total disgrace. I like the Devon team better. They ring with more humility. The best part? Some towns took it so seriously that they hosted inter-parish competitions. Yes, competitive bell ringing. With rules, scoring, reputations, and scandal. Picture it. 2 teams of exhausted Englishmen face off in adjacent towers. 8 hours of rigorous chiming. Someone passes out from dehydration. The final peal is slightly off-tempo. A fight breaks out over the use of a non-traditional method. The bishop has to get involved. A local goose is declared the winner by default. There were even records, both written and oral, tracking which towns had the best bell teams, which towers had the clearest tones, and which ringers were secretly sleeping with a priest's niece, the ultimate disqualifier, apparently. And because this is the Middle Ages, and humans never know when to stop, people started naming individual bells like they were celebrities. Some had names like Gabriel, Peter, or Voice of the Lord. Others were more aggressive. Thunder of Christ. The Doom Knell. Justice and Mercy. One bell in Germany was called the Avenger, which honestly sounds like a superhero who only fights in with volume. And these weren't just symbolic. Bells were often blessed, anointed, and considered part of the community's spiritual defense. If a particularly musical bell existed, it might be attributed to divine tuning, as if angels had personally meddled with the alloy mix. And, I kid you not, some people believed that a perfectly tuned bell could ward off storms. So if your team rang a flawless pattern and no one got struck by lightning that month, that's proof of righteousness. Now, let's not forget the sheer physicality of all this. As bell towers got bigger and more ambitious, the bells themselves got heavier. Some were multiple tons. Their ropes had counterweights, their beams reinforced, and the ringers were chosen based on height, coordination, and core strength. Seriously, some 17th century ringers had better abs than modern gym rats. They had to. Because pulling a 5-foot bronze bell 60 times in a row is functionally the same as bench pressing the concept of time. But even among these titans of tone, there was hierarchy. The treble bell, the lightest and highest pitched, often went to the newest or smallest ringer. The tenor bell, deepest and heaviest, went to the veteran, the one with the most experience, calmest nerves, and largest hands. Misring the tenor was considered a scandal. There were entire pamphlets on the psychological toll of a bad bell performance. Imagine spending 6 hours memorizing an 800 change sequence only to mess up on change number 797. Some quit the guild in shame. Others claimed divine interference. One record describes a mun who allegedly faked a fainting spell to cover for his miscue. Another reportedly blamed it on bell gremlins, which were absolutely not real, but conveniently unprovable. Eventually, by the 18th century, bell ringing evolved into a respected musical discipline. It became part of formal education in some places. Theories were written. Ringers were buried with honors. Bell towers became architectural showcases, their acoustics meticulously designed for maximum reverberation. But in the villages, even the smallest churches got swept up in the trend. A tiny bell tower that once signaled time to milk the cows was now hosting elaborate sound experiments featuring a 12-year-old apprentice named Hugo trying not to vomit from vertigo. And even then, in the midst of all this sonic sophistication, the original purpose of the bell remained: to mark the hours, to call to prayer, to warn, to celebrate, and, perhaps most importantly, to keep everyone in the village just a little bit awake. Which, ironically, makes this the most inappropriate bedtime story. But you're still here, listening, somewhere between awake and asleep. Maybe you've been lulled by the rhythm of bronze history, or maybe you're just enjoying the slow descent into this very specific, very loud slice of the past. Either way, our journey isn't over.